The soft, clinical hiss of an air-conditioned room creates a specific kind of silence, a sterilized vacuum where the ambient noise of the living world is systematically filtered out. In these modern spaces of self-examination, we sit upon furniture designed with clean, minimalist lines, surrounded by the pale ivory pages of our expensive journals and the smooth, warm plastic of our devices. A synthetic rain machine hums in the corner, its digital loop offering a predictable, non-threatening simulation of nature, while a single premium candle emits a scent formulated to induce a state of calculated calm. Everything in this environment is controlled, curated, and profoundly safe. We have constructed these sanctuaries to look into our own darkness. Yet the very architecture we inhabit ensures that the darkness remains polite, well-behaved, and thoroughly managed. We open our leather-bound notebooks to record our feelings, our pens moving with a fluid, practiced grace as we catalogue our psychological states with a sophisticated vocabulary of wounding. We speak of our inner child, our boundary violations, our attachment styles, and our systemic dysregulation. We have become meticulous archivists of our own sorrow, transforming the raw, jagged fractures of our human experience into a beautifully organized library of pain, where every tragedy is neatly indexed, cross-referenced, and filed under the appropriate diagnostic label. We do not realize that in this hyper-aware modern life, we have evolved from simply hurting progress and trading upon our hurts. We have found a strange, weightless comfort in the identity of the injured party. When life inflicts its inevitable wounds upon us, we no longer allow them to simply bleed, heal, or scar in the dark. We bring them out into the light of our analytical minds. We wash them in the sterile fluids of contemporary psychology, and we dress them in the language of clinical validation. We display our traumas like rare, delicate antiquities inside a temperature-controlled museum, keeping them safe from the air, safe from decay, and safe from the radical, unpredictable currents of the present moment. We believe that by understanding our history with such flawless intellectual clarity, we are achieving liberation. But beneath our sophisticated narratives, we feel a persistent, hollow ache. We have mastered the art of talking about our suffering, yet we have forgotten how to actually feel it on the raw, unedited surface of our skin. We are thoroughly analyzed, yet entirely untransformed. We have turned our wounds into a fortress, and we are sitting inside its cold stone walls, watching our lives pass by through a microscopic lens, wondering why the clean, clinical air we breathe feels so entirely devoid of vitality. Let us look honestly at this collective habit we have cultivated, this modern instinct to commodify our sorrow. We live in an era where vulnerability is no longer a dangerous exposure, but a highly esteemed cultural currency. We have discovered that if we present ourselves as complete, undamaged, and self-sufficient, the world meets us with an indifferent, hyper-competitive hostility. But if we package our brokenness with the right aesthetic texture, if we frame our struggles with the precise clinical terminology of the day, we are granted immediate access to a community of validation. We earn social capital through our disclosures. We establish moral authority through our victimhood. We build whole identities and personal brands around the story of what was done to us. The ego, that ancient and cunning architect of survival, quickly learns that a well-curated wound can be used as an ironclad shield against the demands of life. It realizes that if we are perpetually classified as the one who is recovering, the one who is fragile, or the one who is carrying ancestral trauma, we are handed a permanent exemption from the terrifying necessity of change. We use our histories to justify our current rages, our relational coldness, and our refusal to step into the unmapped territory of our true potential. We have turned our pain into an asset, a precious possession that we cannot afford to lose, because we do not know who we would be if we walked out of the museum and dropped the story of our brokenness into the dust. We feel the physical price of this preservation strategy within our very bones, a chronic structural rigidity that deforms our living anatomy. The body cannot read our psychological textbooks, it only understands the immediate reality of our muscle tissue and our breath. When we freeze our historical grief into a permanent identity narrative, we are forcing our physiology to hold the posture of an ancient impact indefinitely. Consider how we stand and move when we are inhabiting the role of the preserved survivor. The spine, which should be a fluid, articulating river of bone that moves with every shift in our environmental balance, hardens into a protective, defensive curve. The upper back rounds slightly forward, drawing the shoulders inward toward the sternum to form a permanent physical canopy over the heart center. This is the posture of a creature that is perpetually preparing for a blow that landed 20 years ago. The chest collapses, flattening the space where the lungs should expand with the radical, unrestricted generosity of the wind. We learn to take shallow, cautious breaths that never descend below the throat, keeping our respiration confined to the rigid cage of the collarbones, because a true, deep breath would disturb the delicate, frozen arrangement of our unfelt grief. Observe the eyes of a generation that has learned to curate its hurt. They are not soft, receptive portals that allow the world to enter. They are hypervigilant instruments of surveillance. They widen slightly, scanning every room, every conversation, and every relational interaction for microsignals of threat or invalidation. We call this hypervigilance a symptom of our trauma, but it is also the active mechanism of our curation. We are looking for things that match our archive. We are scanning the horizon to find the precise behavior that will confirm our status as the misunderstood, the mistreated, or the inherently fragile. The jaw locks, the muscles at the root of the tongue tighten, and the throat becomes a narrow, dry valve, where our unscripted, undignified cries are held back in the name of a composed, therapeutic presentation. We walk through the world looking entirely self-aware, delivering beautifully structured monologues about our healing journeys, while our internal organs are locked in a state of permanent, icy suspension, suffocating under the weight of the very history we claim to be releasing. This is the great illusion of the sterile archive, the belief that a wound can be healed by preserving it behind glass. We have built an entire psychological economy around the act of remembering, analyzing, and documenting our scars, while forgetting that the ultimate goal of any natural healing process is to let the past rot so that something completely new can grow in its place. Let us contrast this clinical preservation with the raw, un-embalmed reality of the wilderness. If you walk deep into an old-growth forest, away from the manicured paths and the informational signs of national parks, you are entering an architecture of pure, unmanaged decay. The wilderness does not keep historical ledgers of its tragedies. When a lightning bolt splits an ancient oak in half, crashing its massive crown into the forest floor, the woods do not erect a monument to the catastrophe. The tree does not spend the next century trying to explain why it was struck, or analyzing the weather patterns that permitted the fire to burn its bark. Instead, the fallen oak is immediately subjected to the radical, undignified hospitality of the earth. The rain falls upon its split grain without pity. The winter frost cracks its heartwood. The mosses and liverworts crawl over its shattered limbs, wrapping them in a damp green shroud. Countless insects, fungi, and bacteria descend upon the corpse, eating into its memory, breaking down its rigid structures, and turning its proud history into soft, dark, and pungent compost. The decay is messy, it smells of fermentation and damp earth. It is completely unphotogenic and entirely devoid of symmetry. It is a process of total exposure, where the tree must give up its identity as an oak and allow itself to be dissolved into the collective matrix of the forest floor. But within a few seasons, that rotting log becomes the richest soil in the entire woods. New ferns sprout from its crumbling spine, ancient saplings sink their roots directly into its decayed marrow, drinking from the very cataclysm that destroyed their ancestor. The tragedy is not preserved, it is digested. It is transformed from a static historical monument into the vital, anonymous topsoil that fuels the wild, uncurated surge of the current spring. We have forgotten how to let our lives decay in this way. We have become so terrified of the raw, chaotic, and unmarketable reality of real grief that we prefer the clean, eternal stasis of the museum. When an experience breaks us, when a marriage ends, when a career collapses, or when an ancient betrayal is uncovered, we do not drop to our knees and let the rain of reality dissolve us. We do not lie on the floor of our lives and allow our pride, our certainty, and our identity to rot openly in the dark. Instead, we immediately call our therapist, we open our self-help journals, and we begin the process of emotional taxidermy. We stuff the wild, screaming animal of our pain with the sawdust of clinical definitions. We stitch its eyes shut with psychological frameworks. We mount it on a wooden pedestal of resilience, and we place it in the center of our personal narrative so that we can show everyone how beautifully we have processed our experience. We remain clean, we remain articulate, and we remain completely frozen in the exact shape of our historical injury. We must begin to see through this sophisticated trap of the modern ego. The ego does not care whether it is celebrated for its victories or pitied for its wounds, as long as it is recognized as a solid, permanent, and significant entity. It looks at the fluid, impermanent, and terrifying river of life, a river that threatens to wash away our names, our achievements, and our definitions with every passing hour, and it panics. It craves stability at all costs. If it cannot achieve stability through being the strongest, the richest, or the most successful, it will gladly achieve stability through being the most profoundly damaged person in the room. A permanent wound provides a permanent orientation. It tells us exactly who we are, it dictates how we should behave, and it establishes a predictable boundary between ourselves and the world. The moment we define ourselves as a survivor of a specific trauma, we have frozen the river of our consciousness into a solid block of ice. We can now build a home on that ice. We can write books about the texture of the ice, and we can gather with others who live on identical glaciers, while completely ignoring the truth that the ice is melting beneath our feet and that our attachment to its frozen safety is keeping us from inheriting the vast, warm and flowing ocean of our original nature. Let us pause here, in the middle of this cold archive we have built, and feel the weight of our collective exhaustion. We are tired of being so incredibly self-aware. We are tired of tracking our triggers like a hunter scanning the brush for predators. We are tired of translating every spontaneous movement of our heart into a clinical diagnosis. We sit in our beautifully lit, air-conditioned sanctuaries, surrounded by our wellness tools and our psychological insights, and we feel a profound, unquenchable thirst for the wild water of reality. We want to be touched by life without a conceptual middleman. We want to feel an emotion without needing to verify its lineage or justify its expression to an internal board of auditors. We want to let our guards down completely, to drop our marble shields, to step out of the museum, and to allow ourselves to be messy, unpolished, and thoroughly human. We yearn to return to the un-embalmed wilderness of our bare awareness, where our pain can finally stop being an asset, a brand, or a destiny, and become what it's all meant to be, a passing storm that washes through the soil of our presence, leaving us clean, grounded, and entirely open to the unscripted miracle of the next breath. To witness the construction of this internal museum, we must examine the specific blueprints we use to preserve our pain, blueprints that manifest as sophisticated survival strategies in our daily behavior. We are initiated into this culture of clinical preservation the moment we realize that a raw, uneducated emotion receives no quarter from a busy world, while a neatly packaged psychological diagnosis commands immediate deference. Over time, we split into specialized archetypes of the sanitized scar, each erecting a different style of exhibition, yet both paying the same devastating biological tax to keep their ghosts on display. Consider first the figure who moves through the modern landscape as the diagnostic archivist. To sit across from this individual is to encounter a masterclass in intellectualized self-awareness. Their speech is fluid, elegant, and utterly saturated with the cutting-edge vocabulary of the clinical world. They do not merely have bad days or difficult relationships, they experience complex activation, trauma loops, and systemic nervous system dysregulation. When they encounter friction with a colleague or a partner, they do not permit themselves to experience a sudden, undignified burst of irrational temper, nor do they allow their eyes to fill with the messy, hot tears of ordinary frustration. Instead, they pause, adjust their posture with an almost mechanical precision, and deliver a flawless, detached autopsy of the interaction. They explain that their anxious attachment style has been triggered by the other person's avoidant withdrawal, which has compromised their psychological safety and violated a core boundary rooted in their early childhood conditioning. On the surface, it appears that this person has achieved the pinnacle of emotional maturity and self-realization. They can map their internal topography with the accuracy of a surveyor, but if we plunge beneath the smooth, articulate surface of this presentation, we discover a subterranean vault of profound, paralyzing terror. The diagnostic archivist is using their psychological labels not as a path to transformation, but as a sophisticated form of emotional insulation. They have discovered that if you can name an entity with perfect clinical accuracy, you do not actually have to feel its heat. They wrap their grief, their rage, and their shame in heavy blankets of therapeutic jargon, ensuring that these wild, chaotic energies remain safely categorized and preserved behind glass. They are deeply terrified of the un-embalmed wilderness of their own flesh. They cannot afford to let their heart break open in its raw animal simplicity, because a raw heartbreak is chaotic, messy, and cannot be controlled by an intellectual framework. It would require them to drop their diagnostic charts, abandon their role as the enlightened observer of their own pain, and dissolve into the unpredictable, weeping mud of bare sensation. Contrast this with the second archetype that dominates our high-performance culture, the martyr of resilience. This is the individual who has turned the story of their overcoming into a grand architectural monument, a personal empire, or a highly visible public identity. Do not hide behind a facade of clinical detachment. They hide behind a glittering narrative of heroic survival. Their past is an uninterrupted sequence of severe adversities, toxic environments, and systemic betrayals, all of which they have triumphantly conquered through sheer force of will and spiritual discipline. They speak constantly of their healing journey, their shadow work, and their evolutionary growth. They write essays, lead seminars, or curate their digital platforms to share the strategic lessons of their resilience, transforming their historical wounds into the very foundation of their current social and professional authority. The martyr of resilience is widely celebrated by our optimization-obsessed culture as an inspiration. But if we watch them when the stage lights are turned off, when they are sitting alone in the cold kitchen of their home at midnight, or when they are staring at the clinical blue light of their device in an airport loungeways, see a profound systemic exhaustion. The martyr is trapped in a parasitic relationship with their own history. They have built an identity so entirely dependent on the act of overcoming their trauma that they cannot afford to ever fully leave it behind. If their wounds were to genuinely heal, if the scars were to fade into soft, anonymous skin that no longer required validation or commentary, the entire structure of their authority would collapse. They are compelled to continuously scratch open their old scabs to prove to the world and to themselves that they are still surviving, still resilient, still heroic. They have frozen themselves in a state of permanent recovery, keeping the ghost of their abuser, their failure, or their tragedy alive in the center of their psyche to act as the necessary contrast for their manufactured light. To maintain these sophisticated roles, whether it is the articulate archivist or the heroic survivor, both archetypes must transform their physical bodies into a high-maintenance holding cell. The living anatomy cannot comprehend the clever narratives of the ego. It only registers the mechanical tension required to keep a memory from moving. When we turn our pain into a permanent identity, we alter the biological blueprint of our flesh, locking ourselves into a state of chronic, unyielding somatic stasis that poisons our internal ecology. Let us track this physical deformation downward through the structure of the human frame, beginning with the pelvic floor and the deep muscles of the groin. In an un-embalmed human being who has allowed their history to compost naturally into the earth, the pelvis is a heavy, receptive bowl that swings fluidly with every step, absorbing the impact of gravity and connecting the legs to the core of the spine. But in the body of the preserved survivor, the pelvic floor becomes a tightly clenched fist. This area is the primal seat of our survival instincts, the anatomical basement where we store the raw, undifferentiated impulses of fear, shame, and sexual vitality. When we decide that our pain must be managed and curated, we unconsciously tighten the pubococcygeus and levator ani muscles, creating a permanent hydraulic dam at the base of the torso. This chronic clenching acts as an internal trapdoor, preventing the dark, chaotic, and unmarketable currents of our historical terror from rising up into our awareness. The consequence is a profound stagnation of life force. The lower back hardens into a rigid sheet of tension, the hips lose their native articulation, and the deep reproductive and digestive organs are starved of fresh, oxygenated blood left to stew in a cold, acidic bath of uncomposted stress hormones. Move upward to the root of the tongue and the deep structures of the throat. In a human being who has surrendered the need to curate their presentation, the tongue rests easily in the lower jaw like a soft, heavy leaf, and the throat remains a wide, open channel for the uninhibited expression of truth, laughter, and lamentation. But in the body of the clinical archivist, the root of the tongue is pulled backward and downward toward the larynx, forming an invisible permanent chokehold on the vocal apparatus. This tension is the physical mechanism of the internal editor. It is the muscle tissue holding back the crude, non-therapeutic scream of raw grief. It is the throat tightening to ensure that when we speak of our pain, our voice remains modulated, intelligent, and composed. We are literally strangling our own animal voice to preserve our psychological reputation, creating a chronic restriction that manifests as a dry lump in the throat, a perpetual tightness in the cervical spine, and a deep, systemic disconnection between the intelligence of our brain and the wild wisdom of our heart. This holding pattern reaches its apex in the rigid suspension of the diaphragm. The diaphragm is designed by nature to be a fluid, dynamic dome that rises and falls with the unmanaged rhythm of the world, dropped low into the abdomen during relaxation and lifting smoothly during release. But in the curated body, the diaphragm is pinned in a state of suspended animation, frozen halfway between an inhalation and an exhalation. We pull the upper abdomen inward and upward, bracing the rectus abdominis and the solar plexus to create an internal breastplate of muscular armor. This armor serves a precise defensive purpose. It numbs the stomach lining, preventing us from feeling the raw, visceral sensations of vulnerability, nausea, and existential disorientation that arise when our historical narratives are challenged by reality. By locking the diaphragm, we ensure that our breath remains shallow, rapid, and confined entirely to the upper chest, near the collarbones. This is apical breathing, the evolutionary distress signal of a primate that is trapped in a corner. By breathing this way every hour of every day to maintain our composure, we are drowning our internal organs in a continuous low-grade chemical bath of adrenaline and cortisol. The stomach lining grows cold and tight. The digestion becomes a sluggish, toxic lake of unassimilated nutrients, and the entire nervous system remains stuck in a high-frequency vibration of survival panic, even while we are sitting in a luxurious environment delivering a serene lecture on emotional intelligence. This is the ultimate tragedy of the sanitized scar. We have achieved absolute narrative control at the expense of our biological vitality. The ego, in its desperate pursuit of safety, has accomplished a magnificent feat of psychological taxidermy. It has taken the wild, unpredictable, and potentially dangerous river of our raw consciousness and diverted it into a series of concrete, parallel canals. It has named every current, measured every depth, and built beautiful stone walkways along the edges so that our friends, our therapists, and our social networks can walk alongside our suffering without anyone ever getting wet, muddy, or dirty. We have made our pain safe for public consumption. We have transformed our tragedies into an intellectual asset, a conversational prop, a badge of distinction that guarantees we will never be overlooked or forgotten by a culture that feeds on vulnerability. But the price of this taxidermy is a profound, unquenchable isolation. When you are praised for your resilience, when you are respected for your clinical self-awareness, and when you are welcomed into community for your beautifully packaged trauma narrative, a dark, icy wall of loneliness hardens around your core. You know, with a clarity that no amount of therapeutic validation can soften, that the world is not meeting you. The world is visiting the museum. They are admiring the exhibits, they are applauding the layout, they are paying respect to the archivist who has organized the collection so beautifully. The actual, living human being, the one who is sitting in the dark behind the glass display cases, the one who is currently confused, ugly, petty, or filled with an undignified, non-transformative rage that has no place in a self-help book remains completely untouched, completely unseen, and completely unloved. You have built a beautiful cage out of your history, and you have become its most celebrated exhibit, standing under the sterile museum lights, delivering your practiced monologue to a rotating crowd of spectators, while your actual flesh is starving for the damp, cold, and liberating touch of the unmanaged earth. We find ourselves trapped in a state of perpetual psychological audit, continuously checking our behavior against our archive to ensure that our current actions match our historical brand. If we experience a sudden, spontaneous moment of pure joy, unburdened by our past, the archivist quickly steps in to correct the alignment, reminding us of our identity as a traumatized person who must remain vigilant, careful and protective of their boundaries. We become hypersensitive to any environment or relationship that threatens to melt our ice. If someone approaches us with a love that is too simple, too direct, and too unconcerned with our history, a love that refuses to play the game of mutual trauma matching, we feel a sudden, sharp surge of panic. We do not register this panic as fear of intimacy. We use our clinical vocabulary to diagnose it as a red flag, an energetic incompatibility, or a lack of psychological safety. We cut ties, we reset our environment, and we retreat back to the safe, predictable stasis of our museum, because we are terrified that if we let that wild, uncurated light touch our skin, it will melt the glaciers of our identity, dissolve our asset, and leave us standing in the present moment as a nobody, an unanalyzed, unmonumentalized, and completely exposed organism that has nothing to trade upon but the immediate reality of its breath. We have forgotten that this whole elaborate museum is a phantom construct built by a frightened mind. We have forgotten that the wounded self we are spending so much energy preserving, documenting, And defending is not a solid, unchangeable granite monument that was permanently cast by our childhood or our past tragedies. It is an illusion maintained by the continuous repetition of a memory. It is a series of old cinematic frames that the mind insists on projecting onto the blank screen of the present moment, over and over again, to avoid the radical, terrifying freedom of looking at the empty theater. We are like a prisoner who has been handed the keys to his cell, yet refuses to walk through the open gate because he has spent 40 years writing a definitive, multi-volume history of the prison walls, and he does not know who he will be if he steps out into the vast, pathless landscape of the open horizon, where there are no walls to define his boundaries, no guards to validate his suffering, and no iron bars to protect him from the beautiful, dangerous and infinite complexity of the living sky. To step through that open gate and abandon the museum of our identity, we must first allow ourselves to be cut open by a radical act of spiritual and psychological surgery. We must look directly into the mechanism of our own suffering, using an ancient, unyielding blade to separate the original pain of our history from the continuous self-inflicted violence of our current presentation. In the deep lineage of human awakening, this dissection is mapped through the foundational understanding of the tu-arosa diagnostic insight that pierces through the polished glass of our therapeutic labels to expose the precise location where we choose our own imprisonment. The first arrow is simply the unavoidable weight of existence intersecting with a fragile mortal biology. It is the raw, unedited friction of a changing universe. It is the cold reality of a hand being withdrawn from ours in the dark, the sudden, brutal shock of a medical diagnosis delivered over a clean desk, the organic decay of a parent's mind as age dissolves their memories, or the jagged, historical fact of an early childhood abandonment. This first arrow is clean, it is direct, and it is entirely unmapped by the ego. When it strikes our tissue, the biological organism responds with an ancient, instinctual intelligence. The nervous system shakes, the throat tightens, the stomach drops, and the eyes fill with salt water. This initial bleeding is not a psychological disorder. It is the natural, dignified movement of human flesh, processing the weather of reality. It is the oak tree being split by lightning in the middle of a summer storm. But as modern consumers of our own experience, we do not allow the first arrow to bleed and heal in its own native season. The moment the tip of that first impact breaks the surface of our awareness, a secondary, far more insidious machinery is activated within our minds. This is the launch of the second arrow. The second arrow is our narrative conversion of the wound. It is the commentary, the clinical audit, the strategic preservation, and the immediate effort to transform the raw pain into a permanent psychological asset. We do not simply experience the heartbreak, we immediately build a museum around it. We don't just feel the terrifying emptiness of a loss, we fire a secondary barrage of thoughts that freeze that emptiness into an identity. Insisting that because we were broken in the past, we must remain fragile in the present, we must view every relationship through the lens of our betrayal, and we must demand that the world continually validate our status as a permanent casualty of history. The second arrow is an act of supreme unconscious violence that we commit against our own liberation. Its tip is coated in the venom of preservation. While the first arrow belongs to the past, the second arrow is manufactured in the immediate present, designed by the ego to keep the initial pain from ever rotting away into topsoil. The ego does not launch the second arrow to hurt itself, it launches it to survive. It realizes that if it allows the original grief to simply move through the body, exhaust its chemical charge, and dissolve back into the space of bare awareness, the wounded self will cease to exist. If there is no more trauma to talk about, if there is no more history to analyze, if there is no more sanitized scar to display for social currency, the ego is forced to face the radical, unmapped uncertainty of this breath. To escape this terrifying void, it shoots itself over and over again with the memory of its tragedies, preferring the safe, predictable ache of a familiar wound to the vast, pathless freedom of an unnarrated life. Let us watch this self-inflicted assault play out in the laboratory of our everyday consciousness. Imagine a moment where a deep, unexplained sadness washes over you while you are sitting at your desk or walking through a crowded market. This is the first arrow, the natural upwelling of an old emotional current that has been stored in your muscle tissue, finally finding an exit point. A natural, unmanicured mind would meet this sadness with a wide, spacious hospitality, allowing the chest to be heavy, letting the throat tighten, and treating the experience like a sudden rain cloud darkening a mountain forest. But the diagnostic archivist within us cannot tolerate an unmanaged storm. The curator immediately fires a flock of second arrows, instantly translating the raw somatic weight into an intellectual project. Why is my trauma resurfacing right now? Did I not complete my inner child work? This must be a manifestation of my ancestral lineage. I am having a PTSD flare-up because my environment lacks psychological safety. Do you see what has occurred in that fraction of a second? The raw, living moisture of grief has been instantly sucked out and replaced with the dry sawdust of clinical theory. The emotion is no longer a fluid wave passing through your cells. It has been converted into an entry in your diagnostic ledger. You are no longer feeling your heart, you are auditing your brand. The suffering you experience from that moment onward is 90% comprised of this secondary commentary, this frantic effort to fit a wild biological impulse into a civilized psychological framework. To heal from this continuous violence, we must turn the surgical lens upon the central illusion of the museum. The belief in a permanent, substantial wounded self that exists independent of our stories. We treat our trauma as if it were a solid piece of iron embedded in our bone marrow, something that defines our structure and must be continuously managed, protected, and accommodated by our boundaries. We speak of my trauma, my depression, my triggers, as if these entities were permanent items of furniture inside the house of our soul. But if we drop the textbooks, sit completely still in the dark, and turn our attention inward with a non-judgmental, microscopic focus, where is this solid monument? Where is the permanent casualty? When we look beneath our therapeutic descriptions, we discover that the wounded self is an absolute mirage. We find nothing but a hyperfluid, ever-changing dance of transient physical sensations and fleeting mental images. We find a hot contraction in the solar plexus that lasts for 4 heartbeats before crumbling into a loose tingling. We find a wave of coldness in the stomach lining that arises in response to a memory, stays for 3 breaths, and then dissolves into a neutral numbness. We find a thoughtless string of black words floating through the dark theater of the brain that vanishes into thin air the very moment we try to pin it down for an audit. We find that we are not a solid noun that was permanently broken by the past. We are a vast, dynamic verb that is being completely recreated with every single pulse of our biology. The illusion of a crystallized, traumatized identity is maintained solely by the continuous, hypervigilant editing software of our mind. The mind takes the fluid river of our sensory experience, highlights only the frames that contain the texture of our historical injuries, links them together with a heavy chain of conceptual narratives, and declares, "This is who I am." It systematically ignores the infinite, open ocean of clear, unwounded awareness that surrounds those frames, because the ocean is empty, anonymous, and cannot be used to build a reputational monument. This is the fundamental delusion that the ancient wisdom traditions sought to shatter. The tragic mistake of misidentifying our vast, creative capacity with a static collection of taxidermied scars. You are not the exhibit behind the glass. You are the space in which the museum was built. You are the ancient limestone bedrock that remains entirely unaffected by whether the surface water is clear or filled with mud. Consider the immensity of the relief that floods the biological structure when this intellectual fortress is broken by direct insight. When you realize that your history is not an asset you need to manage, nor a destiny you need to fulfill, but simply a memory floating through your spacious awareness, the heavy marble shield drops out of your hands all by itself. The suboccipital muscles at the base of your skull can finally let go of their hypervigilant tilt. The shoulders can drop 3 inches down your back to their natural, relaxed carriage. The chest can open with a long, uninhibited sigh that has been locked behind your therapeutic presentation for half a lifetime. You no longer have to spend your precious energy defending a reputation of fragile resilience, because you realize that a reputation is just a ghost. You cannot protect a shadow from light. You cannot polish a mirage. You cannot insure a cloud against the wind. Let us rest in the radical spaciousness of this insight for a long, unhurried moment. The liberation of this perspective is like waking up from a dream where you have spent years wandering through a desert, dragging a heavy, life-sized marble statue of your wounded self on a wooden sled behind you. Your hands are bleeding, your legs are shaking with structural fatigue, your throat is parched with thirst. Yet you keep pulling the sled, stopping at every oasis to polish the statue's marble features, to make sure its labels are legible, and to explain to every traveler you meet how heavy the stone is and how bravely you are carrying it. To wake up is to realize that you can simply let go of the rope. You can walk away from the sled and leave the statue in the middle of the empty sand. It does not matter what happens to the monument. It does not matter if the wind buries it, if the sun cracks its smooth veneer, or if a passing animal uses it for shade. It is not you. You are the one who is walking. You are the breath moving through the lungs. You are the raw, living pulse of life that exists completely independent of that stone representation. When this is understood at the level of our muscle tissue, our relationship to the first arrow changes completely. When a relational betrayal occurs, when a business collapses, or when an ancient memory of abuse surfaces in our consciousness, the pain is felt with an absolute, piercing intensity. It is hot, it is sharp, it cuts into our flesh. But it is no longer catastrophic. The mind no longer converts the biological impact into an identity crisis. We do not say, "I am triggered, therefore my boundaries have been violated and my psychological safety is destroyed." We say, "A memory has arisen, and right now my throat is closing up, my heart is racing like a trapped bird, and there is a cold, heavy stone of grief resting in my stomach." Do you see the profound, revolutionary shift in this alignment? The first statement is a totalizing diagnostic spell that freezes the soul into a permanent category of fragility, locking the nervous system into a defensive posture that requires continuous external accommodation. The second statement is a highly accurate, non-conceptual description of a passing weather system moving through your physical frame. The first statement is written by the museum curator who is mourning a disruption to their pristine exhibition. The second statement is spoken by the unmanicured forest floor that is simply receiving a heavy downpour, knowing that the water will move through the soil, soak the roots, and eventually run down to the sea, leaving the woods washed clean, grounded, and entirely unchanged by the storm that broke across its canopy. This is the path of radical de-curation, the willingness to inhabit our suffering from the inside out, rather than from the outside in. It requires us to cultivate a fierce, almost primal honesty with our own biological sensations, catching the internal editor in the very act of sanitizing our experience. When you feel a wave of petty, toxic, or undignified emotion, perhaps an ugly flash of jealousy toward a friend's success, or a primitive surge of irrational rage that has no place in a mindful, therapeutic lifestyle, instead of immediately repressing it or wrapping it in a sophisticated narrative about energetic alignment, you must have the courage to stop. Drop your attention out of your conceptual mind, sink your awareness deep into your flesh and say, "Right now, there is a sour boiling heat in my upper abdomen. My jaw is locked like an iron vise. My mind is generating crude, untransformative thoughts of violence." This is what envy feels like in a human animal. It is unpleasant, it is thoroughly unspiritual, it is completely unmarketable, and it is exactly what is here. By doing this, you strip the second arrow of its absolute power. The second arrow relies entirely on secrecy, cosmetic shame, and the illusion that we must maintain a pristine, well-regulated presentation at all costs. The moment you bring the raw, unpolished sensation out into the wide-open space of your bare awareness, the moment you treat your ugliness, your fear, and your confusion with the same objective curiosity that a geologist treats a rough, mud-stained rock, the clinical spell is broken. The envy is no longer a terminal diagnosis that requires shadow work. It is just a passing configuration of evolutionary energy. It is just water rushing through a dark canyon in the limestone bedrock. The bedrock does not care if the stream is clear or filled with rotting leaves. It does not try to filter the current before it allows the water to touch its skin. It simply holds the river, knowing that all storms eventually exhaust themselves, leaving the stone solid, immovable and entirely untouched by what has moved across its ancient face. We must understand that the modern culture of trauma curation is not an individual neurosis. It is a collective hallucination born from a terrifying fear of our own wild, unmanaged humanity. We are all participating in an unspoken conspiracy to pretend that we can analyze our way out of our vulnerability. We sit in rooms, we scroll through digital spaces, we look at each other's beautifully packaged healing journeys, and we think to ourselves, everyone else has processed their history. Everyone else is integrated. I am the only one who is still a chaotic, trembling animal behind my therapeutic vocabulary. But this is a mathematical impossibility. Behind every elegant monologue about boundaries, behind every serene face that is breathing through a synthetic rain machine, behind every martyr of resilience who is delivering a polished lecture on overcoming adversity, there is a human organism that is wrestling with the exact same primordial terror. There is a heart that is petrified of being truly seen and rejected. There is a throat that is raw from holding back an unedited cry. There is a body that is racing toward its own inevitable decay. When we realize this, the hypervigilant competition of our self-awareness dissolves, replaced by a deep ancestral compassion. We see that the person who is analyzing us, the person who is weaponizing their triggers against us, or the person who is continuously broadcasting their resilience is not our opponent. They are simply another prisoner of the mirror hall, a terrified human creature who is working overtime to maintain a heavy marble monument to their own survival. Their muscles are shaking under the load, their breath is trapped in their upper collarbones, and their soul is suffocating under the weight of the very history they are trying so desperately to monetize. How can we be angry with them? How can we judge their presentation when we know the exact biological price of the armor they are wearing? The surgical knife of the wisdom tradition does not cut us to make us bleed, it cuts to separate us from the dead, taxidermied tissue of our concepts. It slices through the clinical veneer to reveal the massive, unyielding majesty of our original nature. It invites us to stop treating our souls as historical projects to be managed, and to become instead the vast, unmanaged wilderness that can receive life and death, growth and decay, clarity and confusion, without losing an ounce of its fundamental weight. It is an invitation to walk out of the therapeutic marketplace, to cancel the continuous audit of our wounds, and to inhabit the simple, un-embalmed and unassailable authority of our own breathing flesh. To inhabit the unmanicured forest floor of our original nature, we cannot rely on intellectual conclusions alone. A museum that was constructed through decades of physical contraction and clinical self-auditing cannot be dissolved by a mere change of vocabulary. It requires a rigorous, systematic, and deeply physical re-engineering of our attention. We must enter into a daily protocol of somatic composting, deliberate training of the mind that strips away the therapeutic filters and restores the nervous system to its raw, un-embalmed integrity. This is not a process of adding new skills, acquiring more spiritual credentials, or optimizing our wellness metrics. It is a process of radical excavation, removing the polished marble display cases to expose the dark, moist earth that has always been waiting underneath, ready to digest whatever we drop into its embrace. The cultivation of this internal wilderness begins with the restructuring of our daily waking transitions. Most of us initiate our day by immediately entering the archive, checking our standing in the world before we have even confirmed the weight of our feet on the floor. We reach out for our devices, and within seconds, we are reading the latest psychological dispatches, scrolling through curated trauma narratives, or analyzing our own standing in the relational market. Instantly, our pelvic floor tightens, our tongue roots pull backward, and the internal archivist takes the throne for another 12 hours of performance. We must break this cycle at its biological root through the practice of the un-embalmed hour. For the first 60 minutes of the day, there are no screens, no analytical journals, no strategic processing of our history, and no effort to look or behave like a healed, integrated person. We allow ourselves to exist as a raw mammalian organism. We let the hair be wild, we let the posture be slack, we let the mind be slow, uninspired and completely unoptimized. During this un-embalmed hour, we seat ourselves in a position that deliberately subverts the pristine geometry of the exhibition hall. We do not sit with the rigid military precision of a soldier on parade, nor do we adopt the performative, hyper-straightened spine of the spiritual aesthete who is trying to project perfect alignment to an imaginary camera. We sit like a rotting log on the forest floor. We allow the base of the spine, the pelvis, and the thighs to sink with immense, uncompromising weight into the cushion or the ground. We feel planetary gravity pulling our skeletal structure down, and we let the earth receive that mass without a single molecule of resistance. We realize that the earth does not require us to present our healing credentials. Before it agrees to support our weight, it holds the unmanicured dirt and the marble monument with the exact same unconditional stability. Once the lower body is anchored in this heavy geological gravity, we turn our attention to the internal mechanics of the breath. Initiating the protocol of the unbraced core, we consciously release the chronic, defensive clenching of the pelvic floor and the lower abdomen, that permanent hydraulic dam that we have maintained for years to keep our historical terror from rising into our awareness. We allow the belly to become completely soft, round, and spacious. For many of us, this simple act of physical de-curation evokes an immediate spike of psychological panic. The ego feels exposed, it feels unprotected. It interprets a loose abdomen as a dangerous failure of control. We recognize this anxiety as the voice of the museum curator, and we meet it by dropping our awareness directly into the physical sensation of the expansion. We breathe down into the very bottom of the pelvic bowl, allowing the inhalation to push against the lower back, the hips, and the deep tissues of the groin. As the diaphragm completes its long-delayed downward sweep, it begins to massage the internal organs, stimulating the vagus nerve and sending a profound chemical message of safety throughout the entire biological matrix. We are no longer the apical breathing animal fleeing a predator or managing a brand. We are the damp forest floor resting under the morning sun. We let the exhalation be long, passive, and entirely unmanaged. We do not control the exit of the air. We do not try to make it smooth, elegant, or therapeutically correct. We simply open the throat, relax the tongue, and let the breath drop out of the body like water spilling over a stone ledge. As we stabilize this heavy diaphragmatic presence, we begin the systematic dismantling of the internal surveillance tower. In our ordinary state of traumacuration, our attention is split. One part of the mind is experiencing life, while another, dominant part is hovering above the experience, translating it into clinical concepts and checking if it matches our historical narrative. To collapse this division, we practice the training of bare sensory immediacy, withdrawing our attention from the story of our life and distributing it evenly across the raw, unfiltered field of our current somatic sensations. We become hyper-aware of the friction of reality. We feel the specific texture of the air as it enters the nostrils, cool, slightly dry, carrying the scent of dust or old wood. We register the precise map of pressure where our clothing touches the skin of our shoulders, noting the difference between the tightness of a seam and the loose freedom of the fabric. We listen to the sounds of our environment, the distant rumble of traffic, the chirp of a bird, the hum of an appliance, not as distractions that disrupt our meditation, but as the chaotic, beautiful music of the universe happening all by itself. We do not label the sounds, we do not diagnose them. We allow them to pass through our awareness like wind blowing through an open canyon. When thoughts or memories arise during this process, and they will arise with frantic, swirling velocity, we apply the protocol of the unedited script. The curator's habit is to immediately intervene in the thought stream, suppressing the negative, ugly, or petty thoughts, while amplifying the noble, brilliant, and spiritually correct narratives of resilience. We strip the curator of this editorial authority. We allow every single thought to appear in its raw, unpolished form. If a memory of an old betrayal surfaces, accompanied by a wave of intense, undignified bitterness, we do not correct it. We do not say, "I should be practicing forgiveness." We simply watch the memory arise, stay for a moment and dissolve. If a thought of profound incompetence appears, saying you are failing at your healing journey, we do not fight it. We do not launch a counter-narrative of self-affirmation. We look at the words as if they were merely a string of black letters painted on a cloud, watching them lose their shape and evaporate into the vast blue space of our baseline awareness. Let us practice this spacious hospitality right now, letting every internal movement be exactly as it is, without adding a single line of clinical commentary. This formal training on the cushion is the crucible, but the true test of the unmanicured wilderness occurs when we step back into the high-velocity friction of our professional and relational lives. How do we maintain this radical transparency when we are sitting in a meeting, when we are confronting a partner, or when we are facing the critical judgment of our peers? We do it through the deployment of micro-excavations throughout the day. A micro-excavation is a per-second somatic intervention that we execute in the very middle of a performance. Imagine you are in a conversation and someone delivers a remark that directly challenges your competence, triggers an old insecurity, or undermines your reputation. Instantly, you will feel the first arrow hit. A flash of heat in the chest, a sudden tightening of the throat, a defensive surge of adrenaline. This is the precise moment where you would normally launch the second arrow, the moment where the archivist wakes up, locks the jaw, shapes a sharp, therapeutic retort about boundaries, and attempts to restore the illusion of absolute poise. Instead of reacting from the mask, you execute the micro-excavation. You do not move, you do not change your facial expression, you do not speak. Internally, you drop your attention from the person's face down into your own anatomy. You find the exact physical location of the impact. You feel the tightness in your solar plexus. You feel the heat rising up your carotid arteries. You feel the clenching of your pelvic floor. You say to yourself, with total, unadorned honesty, "My system is threatened." This is the sensation of fear. This is the animal trying to protect its territory. By anchoring your attention in the raw somatic truth of the moment, You create a microscopic pocket of space between the first arrow and your reaction. You do not suppress the fear. You do not pretend to be serene. You simply hold the fear in the massive, unyielding bucket of your bare awareness, because you are not trying to hide the wound or package it into a narrative of resilience. Your jaw remains loose. Your throat remains open. Your breath drops down into your belly despite the tension. And when you finally do speak, your voice does not carry the thin, brittle frequency of a defensive ego trying to save its therapeutic reputation. It carries the heavy, resonant gravity of someone who is standing on the bedrock of their own reality. You can look your critic directly in the eye, acknowledge their point, or reject their assessment, without needing to edit a single molecule of your human experience to do so. We must also apply this discipline to our relational behavior, implementing a rigorous protocol of de-curated communication. The next time you are about to share a vulnerability, write an essay about your healing journey, or explain your triggers to a partner. Pause before the words leave your lips or your fingers touch the glass of your device. Observe the internal motivation behind the communication. Ask yourself, am I sharing this from the open space of the wilderness as a simple, honest offering of my current human limitation? Or am I manufacturing a product? Am I trying to add another layer of polish to my monument of resilience? Am I seeking a transaction of validation to soothe an unexamined anxiety in my belly? If you detect the sticky, manipulative energy of the curator, have the discipline to withdraw your hand and hold your tongue. Step away from the interaction. Sit with the anxiety that prompted the desire to broadcast your wound. Feel the hunger of the ghost that wants to be verified by external eyes as a certified survivor. And let that hunger burn itself out in the cool, silent chamber of your own body. By refusing to feed the mask, you allow the energy to return to its source, transforming the frantic panic of the performer into the solid, self-contained power of the uncarved self. This practice requires an internal discipline that is far more demanding than the superficial optimization protocols of our modern culture. It is easy to follow a diet. It is easy to track your heart rate variability. It is easy to master the vocabulary of therapeutic frameworks. It is infinitely more difficult to stand before the mirror of your own mind and allow yourself to see your own ugliness, your own smallness, your own profound confusion, without trying to fix them, without trying to explain them away, and without trying to turn them into a marketable narrative of personal transformation. But this difficult excavation is the only path that leads to genuine liberation. Every time you allow yourself to be awkward without correcting it, every time you admit you do not know the answer without panicking, every time you let your throat swell with honest grief in the presence of another human being without swallowing it down, you are chipping away at the foundation of your prison. You are proving to your nervous system that your survival does not depend on the perfection of your sanitized scars. That you can be broken, you can be messy, you can be thoroughly unpolished, and the universe will still hold you with the same absolute, unshakable embrace. Let us realize that this bedrock nature we are training ourselves to inhabit is not something we have to build, manufacture, or achieve through an endless series of therapeutic workshops. It is already here. It has always been here, sitting quietly beneath the noise of our histories and the frantic construction of our identities. When we stop polishing the sanitized scar, the forest floor reveals itself. When we stop holding up the heavy marble display cases of our trauma, our arms can return to their natural length, our chests can soften, and we can finally step out into the world as we were truly meant to be. Not as taxidermied exhibits to be admired for our resilience, but as living, breathing, and magnificently un-embalmed human beings who are fully awake to the raw, wild, and unpredictable current of existence. When the burden of curation is finally surrendered to the earth, a profound change ripples through the entire landscape of our conscious being. We enter into a state of radical transparencia, condition of absolute structural relief, where the need to edit, filter, or justify our existence to an imaginary audience completely vanishes. The mind, which for decades functioned as a tense, high-security surveillance tower, dissolves its walls and expands into the vast, open atmosphere of the unmanaged forest. It becomes spacious, enduring, and entirely unconcerned with cosmetic evaluations. We no longer look at our lives as an ongoing media campaign or an exhibition hall that must be continuously dusted and realigned. We inhabit our days as a direct, unmediated reality, felt on the raw surface of the skin and in the deep center of our living tissues. This internal liberation manifests as a sudden, magnificent rebirth within the physical body. The chronic, defensive bracing that we wore like invisible armor begins to unlock, muscle by muscle, fiber by fiber. The jaw, once clamped tightly to hold back the unscripted impulses of our humanity, drops into a state of heavy, fluid ease, allowing the muscles of the face to regain their natural, warm animation. The suboccipital ridge at the base of the skull softens, allowing blood and oxygen to flood the sensory centers of the brain with clear, unhurried vitality. The shoulders lose their artificial lift, sliding down the back to their true ancestral width, no longer serving as a coat hanger for a performative persona. And the chest, freed from the rigid breastplate of structural pride, expands with an entirely new respiratory generosity. The breath drops effortlessly past the collarbones, plunging deep into the soft, unprotected bowl of the abdomen, expanding the core without a single shred of shame or containment. We walk through the world with our armor discarded, our skin exposed, and our throat completely open to the expression of our immediate truth. In this state of uncarved wholeness, our relationship to the entire human environment undergoes a radical mutation. We find ourselves anchored in a sovereign stability that treats the fluctuations of praise and blame with the exact same quiet equilibrium. When the external world offers its validation, we receive it with a polite, detached warmth, but we do not swallow it as medicine, because we are no longer starving for confirmation. When the world delivers its criticism or its sudden rejection, the impact no longer triggers a catastrophic internal collapse. The first arrow may strike, causing a natural, localized sting of pain, but the second arrow never leaves the bow. The internal commentator remains silent. The mind does not launch into a frantic public relations campaign to repair the reputation, because it knows that a reputation is merely a passing shadow on a wall, a ghost that cannot be enhanced by compliments nor diminished by condemnation. We rest in the unshakable certainty of the bedrock, understanding that whatever is excavated from our lives, whatever is cut away or added by the external environment, the fundamental integrity of our original nature remains entirely unchanged. This was the final, urgent transmission of the Great Awakened lineage, a reminder delivered not to construct a new spiritual aristocracy, but to point every human being back to the unassailable authority of their own bare awareness. They stood before us not as polished monuments to be worshipped from afar, but as mirrors reflecting our own forgotten depth. They reminded us that our true nature is not a product to be perfected, optimized, or displayed in a gallery of achievements. It is a vast natural ecosystem that is already complete, already whole, and already deeply integrated with the fabric of the universe. Our brokenness is not a manufacturing defect that requires a stricter wellness protocol to fix our brokenness, is simply the rough, honest texture of the uncarved stone, the very landscape through which our liberation must be experienced. We do not need to build a fortress of composure to be safe in this changing world. We need to realize that we are the mountain itself, a mountain that can allow the storm to rage across its peaks, the rain to wash down its cliffs, and the seasons to alter its surface, without ever losing a single ounce of its primordial gravity. Let us stand in the clean, dustless air of this realization, looking out over the landscape of our lives from the silent depths of the inner wilderness. The digital screens have grown cold. The applause of the audience has faded into insignificant white noise, and the heavy marble shield that we carried for so many miles lies shattered on the ground, revealing the raw, unpolished earth beneath. The air is cool, the space is boundless, and the path forward is completely unscripted. We are finally here, standing in the majestic, unoptimized wholeness of our own breathing flesh, fully awake to the wild and beautiful friction of being alive. And so, as the performance ends and the silence descends into the deepest chambers of your chest, only one inquiry remains to echo through the empty rooms of your curated world. If you completely stop managing the impression you make on this world, who is the one that is breathing right now?